So thank you for speaking. I believe you're speaking from Malawi. So I hope you won't shame our infrastructures in France. And we're very glad to hear you. So you have 20 minutes, and 5 minutes before your time is out, I'll start waving.
Okay. Well, bonjour tout le monde. And it's really a pleasure to be with you this morning. And thank you for the opportunity to join online. It's been a really interesting morning, getting abreast of these big themes with which the conference is grappling. And I think in the context of the conference, mine is rather a micro study. So I'm inviting you to keep your imagination in Africa, but to travel a little to the south and east and arrive in Malawi, where I want to just speak about two individuals, and the experience that they had in the late 19th and early 20th century in relation to the themes with which we're grappling in the conference. So the two about whom I would like to speak are Malawi's first two Presbyterian ministers, named Harry Kambwiri Matacheta and Stephen Kundecha, who were ordained in March of 1911. Ecclesiastically, their ordination made them fully equal to their European fellow ministers. There were, however, subtle and not so subtle racial codes that reminded them that they were expected to occupy a subordinate position. So I would like to explore how they themselves navigated this somewhat contradictory and ambiguous position in which they found themselves. So both Harry Kambwiri Matacheta and Stephen Kundecha first encountered Blantyre mission of the Church of Scotland during the 1880s, which were stormy years in Malawi's Shire Highlands, where both were born and bred. Both belonged to the Yao tribe, part of which had recently moved into the eastern part of what was to become Malawi, bringing violence and chaos through their participation in the East African slave trade. Into this turbulent environment in 1876 came the Blantyre mission of the Church of Scotland. Under the inspirational leadership of David Clement Scott, it sought to foster the emergence of a genuinely African Christianity. Central to his project was the training of African leaders, and he moved quickly to entrust them with significant responsibilities in the running of the mission. Two worlds were meeting at Blantyre Mission in those years of the late 19th century. And for the two young men trying to come to terms with the rapidly changing environment around them, this was an attractive proposition. Amongst the cadre of young men who were driving the growth of the mission, Matacheta stood out. He rose rapidly through their ranks and was one of 7 selected in 1892 to be trained as what they called deacons. With his 6 colleagues, he successfully completed the training and was set apart as a deacon in November 1894. This office of deacon, as Scott conceived it, was a deliberate innovation in a Presbyterian setup where church government is normally in the hands of ministers and elders. Scott wanted to introduce an African approach, saying, there is no office at home exactly like it. It is distinctly African. He seems to have envisaged his diaconate partly as a first step towards ordination to the ministry, but also as a role that had an element of practical service to it. Matacheta, for example, was trained as a printer, an opportunity that was reserved for the more able members of staff. Meanwhile, he was also cutting his teeth as a church leader, since Scott used his deacons as, in effect, the governing body for the emerging church. As Matacheta recalled, Dr. D.C. Scott relied greatly on his young men who were quick and clever. He loved them so much and often said, "I want to make you pillars of the church." Even amongst this elite group of emerging African leaders, Matacheta cut an outstanding figure. Scott had been dreaming of establishing a mission presence in Angoniland, across the Shire River from their base in Blantyre. The European staff were already at full stretch, but Scott saw the possibility that Matacheta could pioneer this new initiative, along with two European women, Miss Bell and Miss Alice Werner, who had recently joined the staff. This was a dramatic development from Matacheta's point of view. As he recalled, in 1884, the Ngoni had brought their warring to our village. In 1893, we brought the gospel to their villages. In many ways, this was an outstandingly successful initiative, largely because of the quality of leadership provided by Matacheta. However, such was the racialized environment of the time that Matacheta's position was called into question from the outset. The initial point of controversy concerned the appointment of the two European ladies to work under Matacheta at the new outpost at Ntumbi. A combination of patriarchy and racism made the governing committee in Scotland very uneasy about this arrangement. As things turned out, the women soon departed for health reasons, and Matacheta was left to carry on alone. Successful as his work was, however, it was never given the status of being a mission station, nor the resources that followed from such a designation. The governing assumption was that a European missionary had to be in charge before any new initiative could be accorded the status of mission station. In some ways, Matacheta was a victim of his own success. Large congregations resulted from his work, first as a teacher, evangelist, and later as a minister. But his work was never granted the investment and institutional resources enjoyed. Live with the paradox of being hailed as a hero, while at the same time, the institutional arrangements reminded him that his status was an inferior one. Meanwhile, Matacheta and Kundecha were selected as the first two Africans to train for ordination to the ministry. When the two men wrote their first exams, Scott's successor, Alexander Heatherwick, remarked, "It has far surpassed my utmost expectations and confirms me in the policy that our mission should adopt now, the extension of our sphere not by European stations, but by native workers and native outstations." This policy and its implementation could hardly have been more affirmative of Kundecha and Matacheta. Finally, the two men successfully completed their studies and were ordained to the ministry. Matacheta at Blantyre on 9 March 1911, and Kundecha a few days later on 12 March at Zomba. On the day after Matacheta's ordination, Heatherwick wrote to his committee convener in Scotland, "Yesterday's ordination was a day of days in all our lives, and brought back the old days when I called Harry, then a little urchin with 4 inches of calico on him, to come to the mission, to the school." For Kundecha and Matacheta, their ordinations must have been a massively affirmative occasion. Yet, in a colonial context, there were also dynamics at play that would undermine them and cause them to doubt whether they genuinely enjoyed the same status as their fellow ministers who were Europeans. One of the provisions of the 1912 Native Marriage Ordinance was that the government would license clergy who were authorized to conduct marriages. Heatherwick, as leader of the mission, sent in the names of the ministers who were serving with Blantyre Mission at the time. The response of the government was to send licenses for all the European ministers, but not for Matacheta and Kundecha. The only explanation was a terse note to the effect that His Excellency does not propose to license any native ministers of any mission at present. The confidence Blantyre Mission had shown in its African ministers was clearly not shared by the government. There's no record of what Matacheta and Kundecha thought about the government decision. One can only imagine that it confirmed the ambiguity of their position, fully ordained Presbyterian ministers, yet somehow not enjoying the same recognition that was accorded to their European counterparts. Even within the mission itself, there were shades of ambiguity. To give an example, at a time when Europeans were always addressed outside their immediate family circle by their title and surname, with only children being addressed by their first name, it was common practice in the mission to address Africans by their first name, thereby infantilizing them. Even after Matacheta and Kundecha were ordained to the ministry, becoming ecclesiastically fully equal to their European colleagues, the missionaries, Heatherwick included, continued to refer to them as Harry and Stephen. This was not intentional belittling or disrespect, but it showed how far racist and colonialist thinking had seeped into the attitude and language of a mission that, in principle, had very different values. How far the two men were irked by the benign paternalism with which they were treated is difficult to discern. Certainly, they did not confront it directly, but Matacheta's history of Blantyre Mission can be read as a gentle critique of European presumption and paternalism, something to which we'll return in a minute or two. So Matacheta and Kundecha, on the whole, took a positive view of the coming of the Blantyre Mission and the British colonial administration to their area. They had seen the violence and turmoil of their boyhood days give way to a more orderly and peaceful time, which yielded opportunities to young men like themselves to acquire education and the skills to play a part in the new social and economic order that was now emerging. It was a movement that seemed to hold the future, and the two young pastors could look forward to being in its forefront. This confidence was shaken by an abrupt turn of events in 1914 to 15. The outbreak of the First World War meant that instead of the promised peace, Africans in Malawi were sucked into a conflict more devastating than any they had known before. When African troops suffered heavy losses at the Battle of Karonga in October 1914, Baptist pastor John Chilembwe, a near contemporary of Matacheta and Kundecha, wrote a letter of protest to the Nyasaland Times, in which he pointed out that the powerful Europeans who started the war were not being harmed by it, while the African community were paying the price. Chilembwe's letter was suppressed, which is thought to be one factor that precipitated his decision to lead an armed rising against British rule in January 1915. The fallout from the rising posed a dilemma for Matacheta and Kundecha. The rising itself was a short-lived affair, with Chilembwe shot and killed within a few days, his followers scattered. Nevertheless, it was a watershed in Malawi's history, a clear signal that not all Malawians were accepting colonial rule uncritically. For Matacheta and Kundecha, this must have been a deeply disturbing event. They both knew Chilembwe well, and his life story had many parallels with their own. Like them, he had been attracted as a young man to the educational opportunity offered by Blantyre Mission. And like them, he had gone on to be ordained as a pastor. Soon after the rising, the government established a commission of inquiry to investigate its causes. Both Matacheta and Kundecha were called to provide evidence for the commission, which gives us some insight into what was in their minds at the time. The mission was on the defensive, and there was much incentive for its leading African representatives to demonstrate their loyalty to the colonial regime. This they did, but in a somewhat ambivalent way. They clearly distanced themselves from the rising and from Chilembwe's radical critique of colonial rule. But they also made it clear that they shared some of the concerns that had motivated the so-called rebels. In a gentle and understated way, they made it clear that the colonial regime also had questions to answer when it came to forming a complete picture of the causes of the rising. Then both Kundecha and Matacheta went on to serve for many years as pioneering African Presbyterian ministers in the colonial context of the first half of the 20th century. Kundecha died in the mid-1930s, while Matacheta lived to a great old age until he died in 1962, the year that Malawi attained self-government. He had lived through the entire period of colonial rule in Malawi. So how did the two of them understand themselves in relation to the interplay of mission, colonialism, and African life that shaped their lifetimes? Despite the ambiguity of their position, they were fundamentally loyal and well disposed towards the Blantyre mission in which they had received their formation, and by extension, towards the wider colonial order. Their writings witness to a friendship, loyalty, and intimacy that transcended, at least to some degree, the racial barriers that prevailed in their time. Nevertheless, the prevailing colonial conditions imposed limitations on the relationships between Black and white, African and European. Matacheta was well aware that there was an African dimension to the life of the mission, of which even sympathetic European missionaries were little aware. His motivation in writing his history of the Blantyre mission, when there was already a plentiful European authored literature on the subject.
It would be good if you could conclude. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, no, very close to conclusion now. So Maracheta's motivation in writing his history of the Blantyre mission, when there was already a plentiful European authored literature on the subject, seems to have been to tell the African side of the story. It was what his recent editors have described as a rewriting of the history. He stresses, for example, how attempts to place European missionaries in Angoniland were short-lived, and he was left alone to lead the work, with only occasional visits from Blantyre-based missionaries. On this same theme, he offers a broader reflection. It goes like this: it seems that in all of the mission stations, there are Africans who always support the work of God. The whites will come and work for a while and then leave, but the Africans will not leave. They must be honored greatly, for they have become pillars of the church. It's a very gentle critique of a Eurocentric outlook, but penetrating nonetheless. If Maracheta felt belittled and undermined at times by the colonial environment in which he lived, he responded not with fiery confrontation. Rather, while unfailingly expressing respect and affection towards his European mentors, he found his own voice to articulate an African perspective. Gently and courteously, yet firmly, he ensured that he was the subject of his own story. He put the colonial system and even the European-run mission of which he was a part in perspective. The identity and vocation that he and Kondecha discovered was grounded primarily in the African Christian community that would endure long after the colonial system and the European missionaries had been consigned to history.
Thank you very much.